Have you ever wondered what happens when an entire community loses its mind? When fear becomes more powerful than fact and your neighbor's whisper can lead you to the gallows? Welcome, fellow historians and mystery seekers, to Sleepy Hollow Uncovered. In this feature-length documentary, we are journeying into one of the darkest and most misunderstood chapters in American history, the Salem witch trials of 16. We will go beyond the myths of pointed hats and bubbling cauldrons to uncover the chilling, true story of how a society consumed itself in a fire of paranoia, piety, and accusation. Before we begin our journey, a quick note on our production. To bring this incredible history to life in a vivid and engaging way, this channel utilizes AI-generated voice narration and imagery. Please know that while the voice and visuals are created with AI tools, the heart of this channel, every piece of research, every word of the script, and the entire historical narrative you are about to hear is my own original work. My commitment is to historical accuracy and compelling storytelling. And now let us dim the lights and step back into a world on the edge of the wilderness, a world where the devil was not a story, but a terrifying, ever-present reality. Our story begins not with a witch, but with a world called Puritan New England. To understand the firestorm that consumed Salem, we must first step out of our own time and into a world that feels both foreign and faintly familiar. We must travel back to the late 17th century, to the rocky, unforgiving shores of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This was not a world of gentle faith and quiet contemplation. This was New England, a society built on a razor's edge, caught between a demanding God and a lurking devil, where the vast dark wilderness pressed in on all sides, and the light of civilization seemed to flicker like a candle in a gale. The people who lived here were the Puritans. They were not the dour, black-clad caricatures of popular myth, but they were a people of profound and often severe conviction. They were English men and women who had crossed a treacherous ocean not for gold or land, though both were welcome, but for an ideal to build a new society, a city upon a hill, that would shine as a beacon of pure, reformed Protestantism, a testament to the world of God's true way. Their entire existence was framed by a single powerful concept, the covenant. They believed they had a sacred binding contract with God Himself. If they lived righteously, followed His laws to the letter, and kept their society pure, God would bless them with good harvests, healthy children, and protection from their enemies. But if they faltered, if they allowed sin to fester in their communities, God's wrath would be swift and terrible. He would punish them with drought, disease, famine, and war. Every misfortune, from a failed crop to a sick child, was not merely bad luck. It was a potential sign of God's displeasure, a warning that the community had strayed from the path. This belief created a society under constant crushing pressure where the spiritual health of your neighbor was your business because their sin could bring ruin upon your own head. Life itself was a relentless test of faith and endurance. The summers were short and laborious, a frantic race to coax life from the stony soil. The winters were long, brutal, and isolating. Families huddled in small timber-framed houses, the smoky hearth providing the only warmth against the howling winds and deep snows that could cut them off from their neighbors for weeks at a time. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the flickering light of a tallow candle or the glow of the fire. In this profound dark, the imagination could run wild. Every creak of the house, every shadow in the corner, every strange noise from the surrounding forest could be a portent of something malevolent. Infant and child mortality were staggeringly high. To have a child live to adulthood was a blessing, not a guarantee. Disease, which they called distemper, could sweep through a town with devastating speed. Life was fragile, temporary, and often filled with grief. This constant proximity to death reinforced their core belief that this earthly life was merely a prelude, a brief and difficult trial before the final judgment that would determine their eternal fate. At the very heart of their worldview was a stark, unyielding dualism. God was all-powerful, all-good, and sovereign, but he had an enemy, Satan. The devil was not a metaphor for evil, he was a real, thinking, and terrifyingly active entity. They believed he was a fallen angel who roamed the earth, constantly seeking to undermine God's kingdom and drag human souls down to hell. He was the author of all chaos, temptation, and sin, and his favorite recruiting ground, they believed, was the untamed wilderness that surrounded them on all sides. The forest was the Puritans' greatest paradox. It provided them with the wood they needed to build their homes and warm their fires, and the game that supplemented their diet, but it was also a place of profound terror. It was, in their minds, the devil's territory. It was a dark, tangled labyrinth, the home of wolves and other predators, and the staging ground for attacks by the Native American tribes, whom they often viewed with a mixture of fear and suspicion, sometimes seeing them as agents of the devil himself. To be lost in the woods was to be lost in Satan's domain. This constant physical and psychological boundary between the orderly, God-fearing village and the chaotic, devil-haunted forest shaped their entire mentality. The fight to keep the wilderness at bay was a physical manifestation of their spiritual fight to keep sin and Satan out of their community. The Bible was not just a holy book, it was their legal code, their history text, their scientific manual, and their guide for every aspect of daily life. Literacy was highly valued, especially for men, for the primary purpose of being able to read God's Word. The Puritan mind was steeped in the language of the Old Testament, with its tales of divine wrath, smiting, and covenants. They saw themselves as the new Israelites, fleeing the corruption of Old England, their Egypt, to build a new Jerusalem in the American wilderness. This self-identification meant they also saw their enemies through a biblical lens. Anyone who threatened their holy experiment was not just a political opponent, they were an agent of Satan, a threat to the very soul of the colony. Inside their towns, the meeting house was the center of both spiritual and civic life. It was a simple, unadorned building, deliberately lacking the stained glass, icons, and ceremony of the Anglican and Catholic churches they had fled. Here families gathered for hours every Sunday to listen to sermons that were dense, intellectual, and often terrifying. Preachers like Cotton Mather and Samuel Parris would lecture for 2, sometimes 3 hours, expounding upon doctrines of predestination, infant damnation, and the constant, fiery threat of hellfire. The sermon was the primary form of public information and entertainment, and it relentlessly reinforced the core tenets of their faith. Humanity was inherently sinful, most were damned from birth, and only a select few, the elect, were chosen by God for salvation. This doctrine of predestination created a deep, personal anxiety. No one could ever be entirely sure if they were one of the saved. They were taught to constantly search their own souls for signs of grace, to scrutinize their every thought and action for evidence of sin. At the same time, they were expected to watch their neighbors for any sign of deviance. Gossip was not just idle chatter, it could be a form of community vigilance. A neighbor who seemed too prosperous might be suspected of worldly pride. A woman who was too outspoken might be seen as disorderly. An old woman who muttered to herself might be viewed with suspicion. This was a society built on conformity, where social order was paramount. The family was a rigid hierarchy, with the husband as the undisputed head of the household, his wife and children expected to be subservient. The community was an extension of this hierarchy, with the ministers and magistrates at the top, holding immense authority. To question a minister's sermon or a magistrate's judgment was not just dissent, it was a challenge to the God-ordained order of things. It was a crack in the foundation of their holy society, a crack through which the devil could slither. So, as the year 1691 drew to a close, this was the world of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It was a community living under immense stress. They were isolated, surrounded by a feared wilderness, and engaged in a constant, exhausting spiritual war. They were burdened by economic hardship, political uncertainty following the revocation of their original charter, and recent bloody conflicts with the Native American tribes known as King William's War. They were a people primed by their deepest beliefs to see the devil's hand in any misfortune, and to look for a tangible human cause for their spiritual anxieties. They were a society wound as tight as a drum, and all it would take was a single strange event in a small fractious parish to strike that drum and unleash a sound that would echo through the centuries. It was in the small, anxious household of the Reverend Samuel Parris, in the forgotten backwater of Salem village, that this brittle world would finally begin to shatter. Before a single person was accused of witchcraft, Salem was already at war with itself. The tragedy that unfolded was not a sudden sickness that struck a healthy body. It was a dormant infection that flared up in a community already weakened by years of strife. To understand the accusations, we must first understand the battlefield, and in 1692, that battlefield was called Salem Village. First, a crucial distinction must be made, one that is key to the entire story. There were two Salems. They shared a name, but not a destiny. First, there was Salem town, a bustling, prosperous seaport on the coast. Imagine a place of docks and warehouses, the smell of salt and tar in the air, its harbor crowded with masts and sails connecting it to Boston, the West Indies, and even England itself. Salem town was the center of commerce, wealth, and political power for the entire region. It was home to wealthy merchants who lived in grand houses, and it was the seat of the county government and its courts. The magistrates who would later preside over the witch examinations, men like John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, were prominent residents of Salem town. It was urban, worldly, and comparatively sophisticated. Then, 5 to 7 miles inland, past fields and swamps and through dense woods, lay Salem village. Today, this area is the town of Danvers, but in the 17th century it was a world away. Salem Village was the agrarian parish of the town. It was a farming community of scattered homesteads, a place of subsistence, hard labor, and isolation. The lives of its roughly 500 residents were governed by the rhythm of the seasons, the success of the harvest, and the health of their livestock. While the merchants of Salem town looked out towards the sea and the wider world, the farmers of Salem village looked inward at their land, their families, and their neighbors, and herein lay the source of a deep and festering resentment. Salem village was politically, legally, and religiously tied to Salem town, but it was treated as a subordinate. The farmers of the village were required to pay taxes to the town, serve in its militia, and patrol its borders. Yet they had little to no voice in the town's governance. They felt exploited and ignored, a rural backwater forced to support the ambitions of the wealthy coastal elite. Their greatest ambition, the one that defined their identity for decades, was the quest for autonomy. More than anything, the people of Salem Village wanted their own church and their own minister. To have their own church, their own covenant, would be the ultimate step towards independence, freeing them from the long and arduous weekly journey to the meeting house in Salem town, and giving them control over their own spiritual destiny. In 1672, they finally won the right to establish their own parish committee and hire their own minister. But this victory did not bring peace. Instead, it turned the village's internal conflicts into a raging fire. The next 2 decades were marked by a disastrous series of failed ministries, each one leaving the community more divided than the last. Their first minister, James Bailey, left after several years of bitter disputes over his salary. He was followed by a man whose name would later resurface under the most terrifying of circumstances, the Reverend George Burroughs. Burroughs, a strong and capable man, also found himself in constant conflict over money and parish politics. He eventually left in debt, at one point even being arrested at the instigation of a powerful village family. After him came Deodat Lawson, whose tenure also ended in acrimony and division. Each ministerial dispute was a proxy war for the deeper factions that were tearing Salem Village apart. The community had fractured into two fiercely opposed camps. On one side were the Porters. They were a wealthy, powerful family whose land and influence extended from the village to the town. They represented the more prosperous, commercially minded residents who had strong business and family ties to Salem town. They were the village's old money, and they often resisted the push for total independence, seeing more benefit in maintaining their connection to the powerful seaport. They led the faction that was consistently critical of the ministers and stingy with their salaries. On the other side were the Putnams. The Putnam family was one of the largest and most powerful clans in Salem Village, led by the formidable Thomas Putnam, Jr., his wife Ann Putnam, Sr., and his brother Deacon Edward Putnam. They were the champions of village autonomy. They were new money, their wealth based entirely on land and agriculture within the village. They saw the establishment of a strong, independent church as essential to their own power and the future of the community. They were the staunchest supporters of the ministers, and they viewed any opposition to the church as a direct threat to the soul of Salem Village. These two families, the Putnams and the Porters, were locked in a decades-long struggle for control, fighting over land boundaries, lumber rights, and the leadership of the parish. Nearly every resident of Salem Village was, by necessity, allied with one faction or the other. It was into this hornet's nest of resentment, rivalry, and division that the Reverend Samuel Parris arrived in 6. Parris was not a man of compromise. He was a former merchant from the West Indies who had failed in business and turned to the ministry. He was rigid in his theology, arrogant in his demeanor, and obsessed with the authority and privileges of his office. Unlike previous ministers, Parris demanded not only a fixed salary, but also outright ownership of the parsonage and its 30 acres of land, a demand that was utterly unprecedented and deeply offensive to many villagers, especially the anti-Parris faction led by the Porters. From the moment he arrived, his ministry was a source of constant conflict. The Putnam family and their allies became his staunchest defenders, seeing him as the strong leader they needed to finally cement the village's independence. The Porter faction and their supporters saw him as a greedy, divisive tyrant. They refused to pay their portion of his salary and even stopped attending church, a profound act of protest in Puritan society. Reverend Parris, in turn, saw this opposition not as a simple disagreement over finances or politics, but as a battle for his very soul and the soul of his church. From the pulpit, he preached fire and brimstone sermons, declaring that a diabolical conspiracy was afoot in Salem Village, led by the forces of Satan, to undermine his ministry. He saw the devil's work in every dispute, and so, on the eve of 1692, Salem Village was a powder keg waiting for a spark. It was not a peaceful, unified community. It was a fractured landscape of jealousy, simmering hatred, and long-held grudges. Decades of infighting had created deep wounds. The Putnams resented the Porters. Neighbors sued each other over property lines. People argued bitterly over the minister's salary and his firewood. This was the true state of Salem, a community sick with suspicion, where the language of the devil was already being used to describe one's enemies. The witchcraft that was about to erupt would not be the cause of this conflict. It would be its ultimate and most terrible weapon. The stage was set. Now all that was needed were the first actors to step into the light, and they would emerge from the very heart of the conflict, the small, anxious parsonage of the Reverend Samuel Parris himself. Every fire has a point of origin, every plague a patient zero. For the great Salem witch panic of 1692, the point of origin was not a windswept hill or a shadowy forest, but a single tension-filled house, the Salem village parsonage. It was here, within the home of the Reverend Samuel Parris, that the abstract fears of a Puritan world and the bitter conflicts of a divided village would converge and find their human form. The parsonage itself stood as a symbol of the village's discord. It was a modest, timber-framed house, but it was the source of a deeply immodest conflict. Reverend Parris's demand for ownership of this very property had alienated many, making his home a lightning rod for the community's anger. The stress of this public battle did not end at the front door. It permeated every room, creating a claustrophobic atmosphere of anxiety and resentment. Paris, a man who had failed in the world of commerce, had staked his entire identity on his success as a minister. Now, with his authority challenged daily, his household became a crucible of his own insecurity and righteous indignation. Living within this crucible were the children. First, his daughter, Elizabeth Paris, known as Betty. She was 9 years old. In an ordinary Puritan home, her life would have been one of chores, catechism, and quiet obedience. But as the daughter of the most controversial man in town, her life was anything but ordinary. She would have been keenly aware of the hostility directed at her father, of the whispers and cold stares from the anti-Paris faction. Her world was not one of childish innocence, but one of adult conflict, seen through a child's eyes. Living with her was her cousin, Abigail Williams, an orphan of 11 or 12. Abigail's presence adds a layer of profound trauma to the household. Her parents had been killed in raids during King William's War, a brutal conflict with the Native American tribes on the Maine frontier. Abigail was not just a dependent niece. She was a refugee, a survivor of the very wilderness terrors that haunted the Puritan imagination. She had witnessed real-world violence and loss, carrying a psychological burden that no one in the 17th century had the language to describe. In the Paris house, she was given shelter, but also thrust into a new kind of conflict, dependent for her very survival on the goodwill of her embattled uncle. These two girls, Betty and Abigail, along with other teenage girls from the village who would become their friends and fellow accusers, like Mercy Lewis and Ann Putnam, Jr., found themselves in a world that offered few outlets for the anxieties of youth. Their lives were prescribed, their futures limited, and their days filled with prayer and labor. And then there was Tituba. If Betty and Abigail were near the bottom of the household hierarchy, Tituba was at the very foundation. She and her husband, John Indian, were enslaved by Reverend Paris. He had purchased them in Barbados during his time as a merchant, and brought them with him to Massachusetts. In the starkly English and racially homogeneous society of Salem, Tituba was the ultimate outsider. Her culture, her history, and the color of her skin set her apart. She was a slave, a woman, and a person of color, making her triply vulnerable. In the Paris home, she performed the endless, back-breaking labor of a domestic servant, while her own spiritual and cultural identity was likely suppressed or ignored. It is in the kitchen of the parsonage, the warmest room in the house during the long, bitter winter of 1691 to 1692, that these lives intersected in a fateful way. With the Reverend Paris often busy with his sermons and parish disputes, the girls of the village congregated. They sought warmth, company, and a respite from the rigid expectations of their world. It is here, in this circle of young women, that something forbidden began to stir. Later testimony would speak of fortune-telling. This was likely not the dark sorcery it was later made out to be. A common English folk tradition, popular among young girls, was the use of a Venus glass or crystal ball, a simple folk magic device created by dropping a raw egg white into a glass of water. The shapes the white formed were then interpreted to divine the trade or social standing of a future husband. It was a game, a form of adolescent curiosity about the future. We can only speculate about Tituba's exact role. The later sensationalized accounts would paint her as a Caribbean voodoo priestess, teaching the girls dark magic. The reality is likely more subtle and more tragic. She may have shared stories from her own culture, tales that were simply different from the grim Bible stories the girls were used to. Or, as the adult in the room, she may have simply been a passive observer to their games. Regardless, in the eyes of the community, her cultural otherness would later be twisted into something sinister. She was different, therefore she was dangerous. Imagine the scene. The wind howls outside the parsonage. Inside, in the flickering firelight of the kitchen, a group of teenage girls, their minds filled with the era's deep-seated anxieties about life, death, and marriage. Huddled together, they are playing with forces they do not understand, not necessarily supernatural forces, but the forces of social taboo. They are breaking the rules, peering into a forbidden future, in the very home of the man who was the village's moral authority. This was the tinderbox, a household run by a rigid, insecure patriarch, a group of traumatized, bored, and powerless young girls, and an enslaved woman from a foreign land, the perfect scapegoat. They were all trapped together by the snow and the stifling piety of their world. The pressure was building, and soon something within the fragile minds of the children would snap, unleashing a madness that no one could have ever predicted. The games would end, and the screaming would begin. The winter of 1692 was unusually cold. Snow blanketed the fields and forests of Salem village, sealing families in their homes, shrinking the world to the space between four walls. In the drafty parsonage of Reverend Samuel Parris, the air was already thick with unspoken tensions. It was in this cold, claustrophobic environment that the first crack appeared in the village's fragile composure. It began with 9-year-old Betty Parris. Sometime in January, she started to exhibit behaviors that her father could not explain or control. She would lose focus, staring blankly into the fire. She would hide under furniture, making strange guttural noises. Then her condition worsened. She would complain of a fever, yet her skin was cool to the touch. She would contort her body into impossible postures, her limbs seeming to stiffen and bend as if pulled by invisible ropes. Soon after, her 11-year-old cousin, Abigail Williams, began to display the same terrifying symptoms, but with even greater violence. She would fall to the floor in writhing convulsions. She would scream as if in agony, claiming that invisible agents were pinching her, biting her, pricking her with pins. She would crawl around the room, barking like a dog, or letting out agonizing shrieks. At other times, she would be struck mute and deaf, unresponsive to anything, only to erupt suddenly into a violent paroxysm. News of the girl's strange distemper spread like wildfire through the small, gossiping village. Neighbors came to the parsonage to watch and pray, but what they witnessed only amplified their fear. They saw two children seemingly tormented by an unseen assailant, their bodies thrown about the room, their voices crying out in a language of pure terror. The affliction began to spread. The next to fall was Ann Putnam, Jr., the 12-year-old daughter of the powerful Sergeant Thomas Putnam, and Ann Putnam, Sr. Anne was a core member of the girls' circle, and her affliction was a pivotal moment. With a Putnam now among the afflicted, the crisis was no longer confined to the minister's house. It had now directly struck one of the most influential and zealous families in the entire village. Soon after, other girls from their circle, like Mercy Lewis, a servant in the Putnam household, and Elizabeth Hubbard, also began to show the same horrifying symptoms. The affliction had a pattern. It was a public spectacle. The girls' fits would often happen in the presence of others, becoming more intense and dramatic as the audience grew. Most tellingly, their torment seemed to be triggered by any attempt at Christian prayer. When Reverend Parris would try to read from the Bible, they would cover their ears and scream. The sound of a psalm would send them into convulsions. The very name of God became a trigger for their agony. To the Puritan mind, this was damning evidence. A natural sickness did not recoil from the Word of God. This was a spiritual malady. Reverend Parris was at his wits' end. He organized public prayer meetings and days of fasting, but the girls' conditions only grew worse. Desperate for an answer, he did what any reasonable person of his time would do. He called for a doctor. Dr. William Griggs, the village physician, came to examine the girls. He observed their fits, listened to the accounts of their behavior, and considered all the natural ailments he knew. He could find no physical cause. He ruled out epilepsy, which was known to them, and other diseases. After exhausting all known medical explanations, Dr. Griggs was left with only one possible diagnosis, a conclusion rooted deep within the Puritan medical and spiritual worldview. His verdict fell upon the village like a death sentence. The girls, he declared, were not suffering from a natural illness. They were under an evil hand. The evil hand. This was not a vague turn of phrase. It was a specific, terrifying diagnosis. It meant that the source of the affliction was not within the girls themselves, but was being inflicted upon them from the outside. It meant that a human agent, a witch, was acting in concert with the devil to torment them. The doctor's diagnosis took the village's simmering fear and gave it a name and a shape. It transformed a mysterious sickness into an act of supernatural assault. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The focus shifted immediately. The question was no longer what was wrong with the girls. The question, now shouted in whispers in every home and around every hearth in Salem village, was who? Who was the witch? Who was the secret agent of Satan living among them? Who was the owner of the evil hand that was pinching, choking, and tormenting their children? The pressure now fell squarely upon the afflicted girls themselves. In their moments of lucidity between fits, they were begged, questioned, and pressured by their parents and neighbors. Who is it that afflicts you? They were the only witnesses to their own invisible torment, and soon, under the weight of this relentless questioning, they would provide an answer. They would point a finger, and with that single gesture, they would light the fuse on the Salem powder keg. The doctor's diagnosis had landed. The evil hand was no longer a possibility. It was a fact. The question, who is it that afflicts you, echoed in the minds of every adult in Salem village. It was whispered over fences, debated by the fire, and pleaded to the convulsing girls themselves. The community, desperate for an answer, began to look for solutions, some official, some not, and it was a desperate act of folk magic that would finally force the issue into the open. A neighbor of the Paris family, Mary Sibley, grew impatient. Watching the children suffer, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She approached John Indian, Tituba's husband, and gave him instructions for a piece of counter-magic, a ritual known in English folklore as a witch cake. The recipe was grimly specific. Take rye meal and mix it with the urine of the afflicted girls. This dough was then baked into a cake and fed to a dog. The theory behind this ritual was that the dog, after consuming the cake, would be afflicted and would then lead the villagers to the witch responsible. It was an act born of desperation, a folk remedy to a supernatural problem. But when Reverend Parris learned of it, he was incandescent with rage. To him this was not a harmless folk ritual. This was a diabolical act. To use magic to fight magic was to traffic with the devil himself. That this had been orchestrated by his own neighbor and carried out by his own servants, in relation to the affliction of his own daughter and niece, was an intolerable outrage. He thundered from the pulpit against these diabolical means, but the incident had an unintended consequence. It focused the community's suspicion squarely on the Paris household, and specifically on the person at its very bottom, Tituba. She was the outsider, the Bajan slave, the one who was culturally different. Who else would know of such strange magic? The pressure, already immense, now became unbearable. The afflicted girls, especially Abigail Williams and Betty Parris, were relentlessly interrogated. Who torments you? You must tell us. Who is the witch? Finally, at the end of February, they broke. They uttered 3 names, and with these names, the spectral terror that had haunted their minds was given a human face. The first name was the one everyone now expected, Tituba. She was the perfect scapegoat. As an enslaved woman, she had no social standing, no power, no family to defend her. Her foreign origins and non-Christian background, whatever it may have been, made her an object of deep suspicion. In the Puritan imagination, she was already associated with the dark, untamed world from which she came. She was the easiest and most logical first target. The second name was Sarah Good. Good was a destitute, often homeless woman who survived by begging from her neighbors. She was known for her foul temper and for muttering under her breath when she was turned away, actions that were easily reinterpreted as casting curses. She was a social outcast, a disorderly woman who failed to conform to the Puritan ideal of quiet piety. She was a nuisance, a constant, irritating reminder of poverty and social failure. Accusing her was a way of blaming a person who was already despised. The third name was Sarah Osborne. Osborne was a different kind of outcast. She was an elderly, bedridden woman who had not attended church services for over a year, a serious spiritual offense. But more damningly, she was a social lightning rod. She was entangled in a bitter legal dispute over her late husband's estate with none other than the powerful Putnam family. She had attempted to disinherit the children from her husband's first marriage, one of whom was married to Thomas Putnam's brother. Furthermore, she had scandalized the community years earlier by living with her new husband, an Irish immigrant indentured servant, before they were officially married. She had violated both the economic and moral codes of the village. Consider these first three choices. They were not random. They were the most vulnerable members of the community: a slave, a beggar, and a scandalous recluse. None of them had a powerful husband or brother to speak for them. None of them had a strong connection to the dominant Putnam faction. In fact, two of them were in direct conflict with it. Their accusation was safe. It confirmed the existing prejudices of the villagers and targeted those who were already condemned in the court of public opinion. On February 29, 1692, based on the sworn complaints of Thomas Putnam, Edward Putnam, and two other men from the Putnam faction, the legal machinery of the Massachusetts Bay Colony roared to life. Two magistrates from Salem town, Jonathan Corwin and John Hathorne, issued warrants for the arrest of Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne on the charge of witchcraft. The abstract fear was over, the hunt had begun, the constables were dispatched, and the full weight of the law was about to descend upon three marginalized women. What had started with the games of children in a kitchen was now a formal, legal proceeding, and no one knew where it would end. On the first day of March 1692, the gears of justice began to turn. The accused women were brought from the jail to Salem village to be publicly examined. The original venue, Ingersoll's Tavern, was immediately overwhelmed. The morbid curiosity and righteous fear of the populace were so great that the entire proceeding had to be moved to the largest building in the village, the meeting house. The very place where the community gathered for sacred worship was now transformed into a makeshift courtroom. It was packed to the rafters, every bench filled, every inch of standing room taken. The atmosphere was electric, a volatile mixture of legal procedure, religious fervor, and raw theatrical spectacle. Presiding over this chaos were the two magistrates from Salem town, Jonathan Corwin and John Hathorne. Hathorne, an ancestor of the famed author Nathaniel Hawthorne, took the lead. He was not an impartial judge seeking truth. He was an inquisitor, a man whose questions presumed guilt from the very start. He was there to confirm what he already believed, that the devil was at work, and these women were his agents. The afflicted girls, Abigail Williams, Ann Putnam Jr., and the others, were given seats of honor at the very front. They were the star witnesses, the living evidence. First, Sarah Good was brought forward. Unkempt, sharp-tongued, and defiant, she stood before the magistrates. Hathorne began, his voice cutting through the hushed crowd. "Sarah Good, what evil spirit have you familiarity with?" "None," she shot back. "Have you made no contract with the devil?" "No." Hathorne pressed on, his questions relentless, but Sarah Good denied everything. Then he turned to the girls. "Children, look upon her. Is this the woman that hurts you?" A collective yes came from the accusers. And as if on cue, the spectacle began. The moment Sarah Good looked at them, the girls began to writhe and contort. They twisted into agonizing postures, let out choked gasps, and shielded their eyes as if from a burning light. They were performing their torment for the entire village to see. Their pain was her guilt. Hathorne turned back to her. "Why do you hurt these children?" "I do not hurt them. I scorn it," she spat back. But her defiance was useless. The visible agony of the girls was all the proof the crowd needed. In a devastating blow, even her own husband, William Good, spoke against her, stating he believed she was either a witch or would be one very quickly. Her 5-year-old daughter, Dorcas, would later be coerced into testifying against her own mother. For Sarah Good, there was no escape. She was condemned by the performance of the accusers and abandoned by her own family. Next came Sarah Osborne. Frail, sick, and disoriented, she was in no condition to defend herself. She denied the charges, but her answers were weak and confused. Like clockwork, as soon as she was brought in, the girls began their fits anew, clutching their stomachs and crying out that Goody Osborne was pinching and pricking them. Overwhelmed and exhausted, she was quickly led away. Then, a hush fell over the meeting house. The final prisoner was brought forward. It was Tituba, the enslaved woman from the Paris household. All eyes were upon her. She was the outsider, the one from whom this strange affliction had seemingly sprung. "Tituba," Hathorn began, "what evil spirit have you familiarity with?" At first she denied it, just as the others had. "No, I am not a witch." And at that moment, the girls' torments reached a terrifying crescendo. They thrashed on the floor, screamed that Tituba was blinding them, and cried out that a spectral yellow bird was flying from her and pecking at their hands. Hathorn's questioning became more intense. "We will never know what happened to Tituba in the days between her arrest and this examination. It is almost certain that her master, the Reverend Paris, beat her and threatened her, telling her that a confession was her only path to survival. She was trapped. To deny was to be condemned like Good and Osborne. To confess might be a way out. And so, she changed her story. 'The devil came to me,' she said, her voice now filled with a strange conviction, 'and bid me serve him.'" A collective gasp swept through the meeting house. This was it. This was the proof. The room listened, spellbound, as Tituba, the powerless slave, began to weave a terrifying and mesmerizing tale. She spoke of riding on a stick through the air. She described the devil appearing to her, sometimes as a tall man in a black coat, sometimes as an animal, a black dog, a red cat, a hog. She confessed that she had signed the devil's book with a mark of red, like blood. Then came the most chilling part of her confession. Hathorn asked if she had seen other names in the book. "Yes," she answered. There were other names, 9 names in total, and she had seen the specters of Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne with her, tormenting the children. Her confession was a bombshell. It changed everything. It took the magistrate's darkest fears and gave them substance. It confirmed that there was not just one witch, but a coven. A diabolical conspiracy was, in fact, active in Salem village. Tituba's vivid supernatural tale, drawn from a mix of English folklore, Puritan demonology, and perhaps her own cultural imagination, was exactly what her interrogators wanted to hear. By confessing, she had saved herself from the gallows, but she had just condemned everyone else. The examination was over. The magistrates had what they needed. They had the spectral evidence of the girls, the defiant denials of 2 women, and now a detailed, undeniable confession. The floodgates were now wide open. The hunt was no longer a question of if, but of who else. Tituba's confession was not merely a piece of testimony. It was a catalyst. It was the moment a local disturbance focused on 3 outcast women transformed into a full-blown existential crisis for the entire Massachusetts Bay Colony. To understand the inferno that followed, we must understand the power of this single desperate story. First, consider the content of her tale. Tituba did not offer a simple yes. She gave the magistrates a narrative, rich with detail and steeped in the very folklore they already believed. She spoke of a tall man from Boston, dressed in black, who tempted her. She described a book presented by the devil, in which she made her red mark. She gave life to the spectral menagerie, confessing to sending her familiars, a black dog, a red cat, a yellow bird to torment the girls. This wasn't just a confession, it was a confirmation of their entire worldview. Every element of her story, from the devil's pact to the animal companions, was a classic trope of European witchcraft lore, familiar to every man and woman in that meeting house. She gave them the exact story they were primed to hear. Second, we must consider her motivation. Why did this woman, who first denied everything, suddenly provide such an elaborate tale? The answer lies in her utter powerlessness. As an enslaved woman, she was property. She had no rights, no one to defend her. The historical record strongly suggests that in the days between her arrest and her examination, her master, the Reverend Samuel Paris, engaged in a campaign of coercion. He likely beat her, telling her that if she did not confess, she would be hanged, but if she did confess and became a witness for the court, she might be spared. Faced with this terrible choice, certain death for maintaining her innocence or a chance at life for telling a lie, Tituba chose to live. Her confession was a desperate act of self-preservation, but it may have also been a moment of strange, fleeting power. For this one day, in this one room, this enslaved woman, normally invisible and silent, held the entire community in the palm of her hand. She was the center of attention, the keeper of the terrible secret, and the magistrates, the most powerful men in the room, hung on her every word. She told a story, and in doing so she shaped reality. The immediate impact of her confession was catastrophic. It validated the entire proceeding. Before Tituba spoke, all the court had was the strange behavior of the girls and the stubborn denials of two unpopular women. Skeptics could still dismiss the girls' fits as youthful hysterics or even fraud, but Tituba's confession changed that. By confirming that she, along with the specters of Good and Osborne, had tormented the children, she legitimized the girls' spectral evidence. She proved, in the minds of the court, that the girls were not lying or imagining things, they were true victims of a genuine supernatural assault. Furthermore, she provided the blueprint for the madness. Her confession became the master script, the elements she introduced, the Devil's Book, the signing in blood, the spectral travel, the animal familiars, would be repeated, embellished, and expanded upon in nearly every accusation and confession that followed. She gave the accusers a language and a framework to describe their torments, and she gave future confessors a roadmap to saving their own lives. But the most devastating part of her testimony was a single, terrifying number, 9. When asked how many other names were in the Devil's Book, she said she saw 9 names. The court had only arrested 3. This meant there were at least 6 other witches, 6 active agents of Satan, still hiding in plain sight within the community. The hunt was no longer about punishing the accused. It was now a frantic search to uncover the rest of the coven. It transformed the investigation from a legal proceeding into a holy war. The magistrates were no longer just judges, they were soldiers of God, tasked with rooting out a vast diabolical conspiracy before it could overthrow the colony. Tituba saved her own life. She would languish in jail for over a year before being sold to a new master to pay her prison fees, and then she vanished from the historical record. But in saving herself, she had unwittingly condemned dozens of others. She had provided the authorities with the validation they needed, the narrative they craved, and the open-ended mandate to pursue anyone and everyone. The floodgates had been thrown open, and a wave of terror was about to break over Salem. To understand how the Salem witch trials spiraled so violently out of control, we must move beyond the courtroom drama and examine the legal engine that drove it. It was a concept so powerful, so insidious, and so perfectly tailored to a paranoid mindset that it made defense impossible and conviction almost certain. In simple terms, it was testimony from an afflicted person who claimed to be attacked by the specter or shape of the accused. The accuser would claim that while the accused person's physical body was miles away, their spirit form, invisible to everyone else, was actively pinching, choking, or tormenting them. It was, quite literally, a ghost story presented as legal fact. In a normal court of law, this would be dismissed instantly. But in the superheated, supernatural worldview of 1692 Salem, it became the gold standard of proof, and it created a diabolical loophole in the justice system, a trap from which there was no escape. Consider the predicament of the accused. How do you defend yourself against a crime that only your accuser can see? An alibi was useless. You could have a dozen credible witnesses swear you were at home, asleep in your bed, at the exact moment of the alleged spectral attack. It didn't matter. Your physical body wasn't on trial. Your spectral shape was. How do you prove a negative? How do you prove your ghost wasn't doing something? There were no other witnesses. There was no physical evidence to examine. It was the accuser's word against yours, and in the Salem court, the word of the afflicted was believed above all else. The trap was most terrifyingly sprung inside the meeting house itself. When an accused person walked into the room, the girls would erupt into fits. They would scream that the person's specter had just flown into the room and was tormenting them at that very moment. Their real-time agony, performed in front of the magistrates and the entire village, became a live demonstration of guilt. To deny the accusation was to invite this performance. And to the terrified onlookers, what other explanation could there be? They saw a person enter, and they saw children fall to the floor in torment. The connection was direct, visceral, and undeniable. But why would sober, educated magistrates accept such a flimsy, unprovable concept as legal evidence? The answer lies in a grim theological debate that raged among New England's leading ministers. The central question was this: can the devil use the shape of an innocent person to afflict another? A few moderate voices argued that yes, the devil, being the great deceiver, could indeed impersonate an innocent man or woman to sow chaos and discord. To accept spectral evidence, they cautioned, was to risk falling into the devil's own trap. But the hardline view, championed by the man who would soon become the Chief Justice of the trials, William Stoughton, was far more severe and ultimately won the day. Stoughton and his allies argued from a position of absolute certainty. God, in his sovereignty, would never allow the devil to use the specter of a good, pious, innocent Christian to do his evil work. Therefore, the logic was simple and unshakable. If your specter was seen tormenting someone, it could only mean one thing. You had made a pact with the devil. You had given him permission to use your shape. Your specter was your agent. This fatal flaw in legal and theological reasoning became the cornerstone of the prosecution. The intellectual heavyweight of the time, the Reverend Cotton Mather, wrestled with this very issue. He believed deeply in witchcraft and wrote extensively about it, but he also privately cautioned against relying solely on spectral evidence. Yet his own writings, particularly his sensational accounts of witchcraft cases, were used by the court to justify the very proceedings he felt uneasy about. Spectral evidence did two things with devastating efficiency. First, it gave a small group of young, marginalized girls an incredible, intoxicating power. Their visions, their dreams, their accusations, things that were entirely in their own heads, were suddenly elevated to the level of irrefutable legal fact. They could destroy the lives of their neighbors with a single cry. Second, it stripped the accused of all agency and all hope. Piety, good standing, a lifetime of good works, none of it mattered. Logic was useless, reason was irrelevant. Once the spectral finger was pointed at you, you were already caught in a legal machine designed to find you guilty. The unshakable logic of the paranoid had become the law of the land, and the stage was now set for the accusations to spread far beyond the village outcasts and begin to target the very heart of the community. Tituba's confession had broken the dam. The magistrates now believed they were not just fighting a few isolated witches, but a satanic army massing for an assault on New England. The hunt for the other 6 names in the Devil's Book began with a terrifying new intensity. The unholy fire, having consumed the dry tinder of the village outcasts, now began to leap toward the green, solid wood of the respectable community. The accusations were about to escalate in a way that would send shock waves of terror through every household. The first to fall was Martha Corey. She was, in every way, the opposite of the first 3 accused. She was not a slave, a beggar, or a recluse. Martha Corey was a pious, respected, and fully covenanted member of the Salem Village Church. But she had made one fatal error. She was a skeptic. From the beginning, Corey had been openly scornful of the girls' afflictions. She laughed at their antics and declared that they were not bewitched, but were simply poor, distracted children. She refused to attend the initial examinations, seeing them for the circus they were. Her skepticism was a direct challenge to the authority of the magistrates and the validity of the girls' claims. And in the paranoid logic of Salem, such disbelief was not a sign of reason, but of guilt. Only a witch would dare to question the existence of witches. When her name was uttered by Ann Putnam, Jr., the village was stunned, but the machine was already in motion. On March 21st, Martha Corey stood before the magistrates in the meeting house. She was intelligent and articulate, but her every denial was twisted into an admission of guilt. When she bit her lip in concentration, the afflicted girls cried out that she was biting them. When she wrung her hands in frustration, they screamed that she was pinching them. Her very posture of self-defense was presented as a form of spectral attack. The message was clear and chilling. Keep silent, or you will be next. To doubt was to be damned. If the accusation of Martha Corey was a shock, the next one was an earthquake. It was the name that, for many, signaled the moment the world had truly gone mad. Rebecca Nurse. Rebecca was 71 years old, a frail and partially deaf matriarch of a large and respected family. She was universally regarded as a woman of exemplary piety and gentle character, a living saint in the eyes of many. When her name came from the mouths of the accusers, there was an audible gasp in the community. This could not be. 39 of her neighbors, in an extraordinary act of collective bravery, signed a petition attesting to her good character. We never had any cause or grounds to suspect her of any such thing as she is now accused of, they wrote, but it was not enough. The accusation against Rebecca Nurse revealed the ugly underbelly of the crisis. The Nurse family had been locked in a long and bitter land dispute with none other than the Putnam family. It was Ann Putnam Sr. and her daughter Ann Jr. who were the most vehement accusers of Rebecca Nurse, claiming her specter was tormenting them relentlessly. The witch hunt was now clearly being used as a weapon to settle old scores. If a woman as beloved as Rebecca Nurse could be arrested and charged, then absolutely no one was safe. The accusation soon crossed another line. targeting not just women but men, and not just for being witches, but for defending the accused. John Proctor, a prosperous tavern keeper and outspoken critic of the proceedings, learned this firsthand. When his wife Elizabeth was accused, Proctor did not back down. He was a powerful, assertive man who raged against the injustice, calling the afflicted girls liars and frauds. He openly stated he would beat the devilish tricks out of his own afflicted servant, Mary Warren. This was a direct challenge the court could not ignore. During his wife's examination, as he stood in the meeting house defending her, the afflicted girls turned on him. Abigail Williams shrieked that Proctor's specter was standing right there, plotting to attack her. Suddenly, John Proctor was no longer a defender, he was a co-conspirator, an accused wizard. The madness reached its most absurd and heartbreaking point with the accusation of Dorcas Good, the 4-year-old daughter of the accused Sarah Good. The afflicted girls claimed the child's specter was biting them. Little Dorcas was arrested, brought before the magistrates, and interrogated until she confessed, likely by pointing at her mother to stop the questioning. She was then clapped in chains and thrown into the dungeon, where the terrified child would languish for months, her mind seemingly broken by the ordeal. Piety, age, gender, social standing, reason, even the innocence of a small child, none of it mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was power, and in the spring of 1692, all the power belonged to a small circle of hysterical young girls, and their names were the keys that unlocked the jailhouse door. The path to the gallows was now clear, and it was growing wider every day. By late May of 1692, the crisis had reached a breaking point. The jails in Salem, Ipswich, and Boston were filled to overflowing with accused witches. Over 100 people, from respected church members to bewildered children, were languishing in chains, awaiting some kind of resolution. The colony was in a state of legal paralysis. Its original charter had been revoked years earlier, and without it, there was no legally constituted authority to try capital cases, crimes punishable by death. The local magistrates could examine and imprison, but they could not convene a jury, hear a trial, or pass a sentence of execution. The entire system was in limbo, while the accusations continued to mount daily. It was into this chaos that a new governor, Sir William Phips, arrived from England. Phips was a man of action, a rough-hewn native of Maine who had made a fortune by discovering a sunken Spanish treasure galleon. He was not a lawyer or a theologian, he was a practical man tasked with restoring order under a new colonial charter. When he arrived in Boston, he did not find a functioning government, but a population gripped by a massive witchcraft panic. Faced with overflowing prisons and public pressure to act, Governor Phips made a swift and fateful decision. He did not wait for the new general court to convene. Instead, he used his authority to create a special court with one specific purpose: to hear and determine the witchcraft cases. He called it the Court of Oyer and Terminer. This court was composed of 7 judges, handpicked by the governor. The man he appointed to lead it as Chief Justice was the Deputy Governor, William Stoughton. This was the single most consequential appointment of the entire crisis. William Stoughton was not a man of doubt. He was a wealthy politician and landowner, a man of stern Puritan conviction who had been trained as a minister at Harvard. He was not, however, a trained lawyer. His expertise was in theology, and his theology was rigid and unyielding. Stoughton was absolutely convinced that New England was under a direct, coordinated assault by Satan and his witches. More importantly, he was the staunchest public advocate for the use of spectral evidence. He passionately believed the hardline argument, God would never permit the devil to impersonate an innocent person. Therefore, any spectral testimony was, in his mind, infallible proof of a witch's pact with the devil. He was the perfect man to lead a witch hunt, and the worst possible man to lead a fair trial. The court convened for the first time at the end of May. Their first order of business was to establish the rules of evidence. Despite the quiet warnings of a few moderate ministers, the court, under Stoughton's unbending influence, made the fatal decision to officially admit spectral evidence as a valid form of legal proof. They also allowed so-called witches' teats, any unusual mole or skin blemish on the accused's body, to be presented as evidence of suckling a demonic familiar. Confessions, even those clearly coerced, were treated as the highest form of evidence. The very nature of the court was tilted toward conviction. The presumption of innocence we take for granted did not exist here. The accused were not granted legal counsel. The magistrates who had conducted the initial biased examinations were now sitting as the judges in the final trials. The accusers were allowed to interrupt the proceedings at any time with their fits and torments, creating a constant theatrical atmosphere of guilt. The machine was now built. It had the full authority of the governor, a panel of judges led by a man certain of the defendant's guilt, and a set of rules that made a fair defense virtually impossible. It was a perfect self-contained engine of death. All that was left was to feed it its first victim. The court of Oyer and Terminer was now in session, and the trials for life and death were about to begin. The court of Oyer and Terminer needed to make a statement. For its very first case on June 2, 1692, it needed a defendant whose guilt was, in the public mind, already a foregone conclusion. It needed a case that was solid, straightforward, and certain to end in conviction. It found its perfect candidate in a woman named Bridget Bishop. Bridget Bishop was not like the pious Rebecca Nurse or the outspoken Martha Corey. She was a 60-year-old tavern keeper, known for her sharp tongue, a rumored history of quarreling with her neighbors, and a taste for flamboyant dress, most notoriously a red bodice that scandalized her more sober Puritan neighbors. She was, in short, a woman who lived on the fringes of acceptable society. Crucially, she had been accused of witchcraft once before, years earlier, and though she was acquitted, the suspicion had clung to her like a shroud. She was the perfect first target. Her trial was a master-class in the court's flawed logic. It was not a search for truth, but a methodical construction of guilt. A parade of witnesses was brought forth to testify against her. First, the afflicted girls put on their now perfected performance. The moment Bridget Bishop entered the courtroom and looked upon them, they fell into grievous fits. They writhed and choked, claiming her specter was torturing them right there before the judge's eyes. This spectral evidence, now fully admissible, was the primary pillar of the prosecution. Then came the character witnesses. Neighbors dredged up years-old disputes, reinterpreting every argument, every sour look as an act of malevolent witchcraft. One man testified that Bishop's specter had appeared in his bedroom at night, tormenting him. Others spoke of curdled milk and mysteriously lame livestock after disagreements with her. The court also allowed a particularly damning piece of physical evidence. Some workmen, during a renovation of her old house, had found poppets stuck with pins hidden in the walls, small dolls used for image magic. It mattered little that Bishop no longer lived in the house or that such folk magic items were not uncommon. In the context of the trial, it was presented as irrefutable proof of her diabolical practices. Finally, she was subjected to a humiliating physical examination. A group of women searched her body for a witch's teat or any unnatural mark where a demonic familiar might suckle. They found a skin abnormality, which was immediately declared to be a sign of her pact with the devil, despite another examination finding nothing of the sort. Throughout the ordeal, Bridget Bishop remained defiant. She denied every charge, her voice ringing through the meeting house. When asked by the magistrates if she was not troubled to see the girls so afflicted, she gave a sharp, logical reply, "I am not troubled to see them so tortured. I am troubled for them." But reason was no defense. Faced with spectral testimony, years of gossip, and dubious physical evidence, the outcome was inevitable. The jury found her guilty. Chief Justice William Stoughton signed the death warrant. Bridget Bishop was sentenced to be hanged. On June 10, 1692, a somber procession made its way through the streets of Salem town. Bridget Bishop, seated in a cart, was taken to a barren, windswept ridge just outside of town, known as Gallows Hill. A crowd gathered to watch the grim spectacle. This was the moment the crisis became real. The accusations, the examinations, the trials, they were no longer just a terrifying social drama. They were now a matter of life and death, sanctioned by the highest authority in the colony. Bridget Bishop was led to the scaffold. To the very end she maintained her innocence. The Reverend Cotton Mather, who was present, later wrote that she made a final forceful proclamation to the hangman, asserting that she was no witch, that she knew nothing of it, and that she was innocent. But her words were lost to the wind. The rope was placed around her neck, and Bridget Bishop, the sassy tavern keeper in the red bodice, became the first person to be executed in the Salem witch trials. Her death was a thunderous message to everyone imprisoned in the jails and to every citizen of the Bay Colony. The court of Oyer and Terminer was not playing games. Maintaining your innocence, no matter how deeply you believed it, now led directly to the gallows. A new and terrible choice had been laid bare. confess to a lie and live, or stand by the truth and die. The hanging of Bridget Bishop was not an end. It was a beginning. Her death on Gallows Hill sent a clear, brutal message that echoed through the cold stone walls of the jails in Salem, Boston, and Ipswich. The gallows were real, the court was serious, and a new terrible calculus now governed the lives of the accused. They were presented with a devil's bargain, a choice so perverse it would have shattered the strongest of souls: confess to a lie and live, or hold to the truth and die. This was the dark genius of the Salem trials. The court's primary objective was not merely to punish individuals, but to purify the entire community by exposing the full scope of the devil's conspiracy. A dead witch was a threat eliminated, but a confessing witch was a priceless asset. A confessor validated the court's mission, provided fresh evidence, and most importantly, could name other witches. Therefore, the court created a powerful unspoken incentive. Those who confessed and cooperated would be spared the gallows. They would become witnesses for the state, their lives preserved in exchange for their testimony. Imagine the agonizing dilemma. You are a pious Puritan, dragged from your home and thrown into a squalid jail. You believe with all your soul in a God who commands, "Thou shalt not bear false witness." Maintaining your innocence is not just a legal defense, it is a sacred duty. To lie is to commit a mortal sin, to endanger your eternal soul. Yet to tell the truth, "I am not a witch," is to be defiant, to be difficult, and the court has just demonstrated with brutal finality what happens to the defiant. Your choice is this: hold to your faith, protect your soul, and walk the path of Bridget Bishop to the gallows. Or perjure yourself, condemn your soul in the eyes of God, accuse your innocent neighbors to satisfy the magistrates, and save your own life. It was a soul-crushing choice between earthly survival and spiritual salvation. For many, the pressure was simply too much to bear. Take the case of Deliverance Hobbs. When first examined, she staunchly denied any involvement in witchcraft. But under the relentless, badgering questions of the magistrates, and with the afflicted girls writhing and screaming at her feet, she broke. She confessed, and like Tituba, she gave them a story. She spoke of the devil's sacrament, a mockery of communion held in the fields. She described a red book where she made her mark. And then she did what the court needed most. She named names. She pointed the finger at Bridget Bishop, Sarah Osborne, and even the minister George Burroughs. She had learned the rules of the game. Her confession saved her from execution, but it helped weave the shroud for others. Her case became the model. One by one, prisoners began to confess. This created a terrifying chain reaction, a contagion of confession. Each new confessor, to prove their sincerity, was pressured to implicate others. "Who else did you see with the devil?" the magistrates would demand. And so a prisoner would name their neighbor, perhaps someone they had a grudge against, or perhaps just a name that popped into their head under duress. That newly accused person would then be arrested and faced with the same terrible choice: confess and name others, or die. The system began to feed on itself, growing exponentially with each coerced confession. The jails filled with a new class of prisoner, the confessors, who lived in a state of legal limbo, their lives spared as long as they remained useful witnesses against their friends and neighbors. But even as this wave of false confessions began to swell, there were those who refused to break. Men and women like Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, and Martha Corey, who knew the terrible price of their integrity. They listened to the whispers of confession from the other cells. They knew there was an easy way out, and yet they held fast. Their refusal to lie, in the face of certain death, was an act of supreme courage. They chose to sacrifice their bodies to save their souls, standing as silent, powerful rebukes to the court that was now actively rewarding liars and punishing the truthful. The hot July sun beat down on the streets of Salem. If the execution of Bridget Bishop was a warning, the events of July 19, 1692, were a brutal declaration of war. On this day, the death cart would not carry a single outcast woman. It would carry 5. This was a calculated spectacle of force designed to crush any remaining doubt and terrorize the populace into submission. The 5 women led to the gallows represented a cross-section of those ensnared by the court's deadly net. There was Susanna Martin, a witty and defiant widow from nearby Amesbury, long suspected of witchcraft due to her sharp tongue and independent mind. There was Elizabeth Howe, a quiet woman from Topsfield, whose accusation stemmed from a simple neighborhood squabble over a straying cow years earlier. There was Sarah Wilds, another woman from Topsfield, whose primary crime was being an enemy of the powerful Putnam family. And there was Sarah Good, one of the very first to be accused. The destitute beggar, who had muttered curses at her neighbors, now found her journey ending at the gallows, her infant child having already died beside her in the squalor of the prison. But it was the fifth woman in the cart whose presence sent the most profound and terrifying message. It was Rebecca Nurse, the sainted 71-year-old matriarch whose neighbors had risked their own lives to sign a petition for her. Her trial had been a travesty of justice. The jury, moved by her character and the lack of evidence, had initially returned a verdict, not guilty. An uproar ensued from the afflicted girls and the magistrates in the courtroom. Chief Justice Stoughton, enraged, sent the jury back to reconsider, pointing to a single ambiguous statement Rebecca had made. Under this immense pressure, the jury reversed its verdict. The governor, William Phipps, momentarily swayed by her reputation, issued a reprieve, but was quickly pressured by the court to withdraw it. The machine wanted Rebecca Nurse, and the machine would have her. As the 5 women stood on Gallows Hill, a crowd gathered to watch the unholy spectacle. According to eyewitness accounts, they all maintained their innocence to the very end, their prayers rising clear and strong in the summer air, a fact that deeply unsettled many onlookers who believed a true witch could not recite the Lord's Prayer without faltering. It was here that Sarah Good delivered one of the most famous and chilling rebukes of the entire affair. The Reverend Nicholas Noyes, a fanatical minister who had been instrumental in the prosecutions, urged her to confess. "You are a witch," he insisted, "and you know you are a witch." Sarah Good, filled with a final desperate fury, turned to him and spat out the words that would echo through history. "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." Then the ropes were fastened. Rebecca Nurse stood in quiet, pious dignity, a silent testament to her faith. The 5 women were executed, their bodies left hanging as a stark warning. By law, those convicted of witchcraft were denied a Christian burial in consecrated ground. They were to be cast into a shallow, unmarked crevice on the hill. But that night, under the cover of darkness, Rebecca Nurse's family secretly returned to Gallows Hill. They cut down her body, carried her home, and buried her in secret in an unmarked grave on their own family homestead, an ultimate act of love and defiance against the cruelty of the court. The hanging of the 5 proved that innocence was no shield, piety was no defense, and the court, having tasted blood, was only just getting started. With the executions of July, the court of ire and terminer had proven its resolve, but now its appetite grew. It was no longer enough to hang defiant women and village outcasts. To truly eradicate the satanic threat, the court believed it had to decapitate the serpent. It had to execute the leaders. On August 19, 1692, the gallows were prepared for a new set of victims, including the 2 men who represented the greatest threat to the court's authority. The first was John Proctor. He was everything the court despised: a successful, physically powerful man, a rational skeptic, and an unyielding critic of the proceedings. He had seen the trials for the fraud he believed them to be, famously stating that the afflicted girls should be whipped and sent back to their spinning. His crime was his refusal to be silent. From his prison cell, Proctor penned a desperate, eloquent letter to the clergy of Boston, a plea for reason in an age of madness. He wrote that the trials in Salem were a sham. He detailed how 2 of his own servants had been tortured until they confessed and accused him and his wife. He described a method where the accused were tied neck and heels till the blood was ready to come out of their noses. He begged for the trials to be moved to Boston, or for new judges to be appointed. For, he wrote with chilling foresight, we are all condemned already. His letter was a rational, desperate appeal for justice. It was ignored. On the gallows, John Proctor stood tall, a man of property and standing, brought low by the spectral whispers of teenage girls. He maintained his innocence to the last, his final prayers reportedly firm and clear. But the ultimate prize for the court, the man they believed to be the dark mastermind of the entire plot, was another man on the scaffold that day, the Reverend George Burroughs. Burroughs was the former minister of Salem village itself. The accusation against him was staggering, that he was not just a witch, but the king of hell in Massachusetts, the ringleader to whom all other witches paid homage. The evidence against him was a bizarre mix of old grudges and superstition. His legendary physical strength, tales of him lifting a heavy musket with a single finger, was twisted into proof of demonic power. His past financial disputes with the Putnam family were reframed as satanic malice. The court saw him as the keystone. To execute Burroughs was to break the back of the entire diabolical conspiracy. On that day, standing on the ladder with the rope around his neck, George Burroughs did something that terrified the authorities. He delivered a clear, eloquent speech proclaiming his innocence. Then, he did the one thing a witch was supposedly incapable of doing. He recited the Lord's Prayer from start to finish without a single stumble. A wave of shock and awe swept through the crowd. Murmurs turned to shouts. This was not the stammering confession of a guilty wizard. This was the calm, pious prayer of a minister of God. The crowd grew restless, on the verge of turning into a mob to halt the execution. This was the moment the entire proceeding could have shattered, but a figure on horseback pushed through the crowd. It was the influential minister Cotton Mather, the intellectual architect of the witch hunt. Seeing his grand project about to collapse, Mather addressed the agitated crowd. He reminded them that Burroughs was not an ordained minister and that his conviction was just. Then he delivered the fatal line that sealed Burroughs's fate and salvaged the court's authority. "The devil," Mather shouted, "has often been transformed into an angel of light." He had given them an answer. Burroughs's very piety was reframed as the devil's most cunning trick. The moment of doubt passed. The execution proceeded. John Proctor, George Burroughs, and 3 others were hanged, their deaths marking the high-water mark of the court's power. They had executed a minister. They had silenced their most vocal critic, and they had successfully convinced the public that even the most compelling evidence of innocence was, in fact, the ultimate proof of guilt. In the dark theater of the Salem witch trials, one act of defiance stands alone, so extreme in its courage and so barbaric in its consequence that it has echoed through the centuries as a symbol of unbreakable will. It is the story of an 81-year-old farmer who, when faced with the court's corrupt system, chose not to play the game at all. His name was Giles Corey. Giles Corey was a prosperous but notoriously stubborn and litigious farmer. He had a reputation for being a difficult man and had even, in a moment of panic and confusion, testified against his own wife Martha when she was first accused. But as the trials progressed and he too was accused, a profound change came over him. Seeing the legal process for the sham it was, he became consumed by a single powerful resolve. He would not cooperate. He would deny the court the satisfaction of a trial. When brought before the court of Oyer and Terminer in mid-September, Giles Corey refused to enter a plea. He would not say guilty, and he would not say not guilty. He stood mute. This was not an act of senile confusion. It was a calculated legal maneuver. Under an archaic and brutal quirk of English common law, a person could not be tried for a felony unless they first entered a plea. By refusing to do so, Corey legally blocked the court from trying him, and if he could not be tried, he could not be convicted. But why was this so important to him? Because under the law, if a person was convicted of witchcraft, their property and land would be seized by the government, leaving their family with nothing. Giles Corey, realizing he was a dead man either way, chose his final act. By avoiding conviction, he could ensure that his farm and his estate would legally pass to his sons-in-law, who had married his daughters from a previous marriage. He was going to die, but he would die in a way that protected his family's future and robbed the state of its prize. The court, however, had a method for dealing with such defiance. It was a medieval torture known as peine forte et dure, meaning strong and harsh punishment. It was a legal procedure designed to force a prisoner to enter a plea. It was torture sanctioned by the state. On September 17th, he was stripped naked and forced to lie on his back on the bare ground. A heavy wooden board was placed upon his chest. Then, one by one, the sheriff, George Corwin, began to place large, heavy stones upon the board. The goal was to slowly crush the air from his lungs, to inflict such unbearable agony that he would cry out and enter a plea. The magistrates stood by, repeatedly demanding, "Will you plead?" But Giles Corey remained silent, his jaw clenched, his body trembling under the immense, growing weight. For 2 full days the torture continued. More and more stones were piled onto his chest, the weight becoming so great that eyewitnesses later said his tongue was forced from his mouth. Still, he refused to speak the words that would give the court its trial. According to the legend, immortalized by Robert Caileff, who chronicled the events, the magistrates, frustrated by his silence, pleaded with him one last time. And it was then that Giles Corey, his ribs cracking, his breath failing, managed to rasp out his final defiant words. He looked at his tormentors and whispered, "More weight." He had made his choice. He would die under the stones rather than grant the corrupt court the legitimacy of a trial. Shortly thereafter, on September 19th, Giles Corey was pressed to death. He was not hanged on Gallows Hill. He was a man tortured to death by the state in an open field because he refused to participate in their legal fiction. His death was a brutal, shocking spectacle that stunned the community. It was a raw display of the court's cruelty, stripped of any pretense of justice. 3 days later, his wife Martha, along with 7 other convicted witches, was hanged on Gallows Hill. Giles Corey had failed to save her, but he had succeeded in his final desperate goal. His property was not forfeit. It passed to his heirs, his final silent act of defiance against a system that had taken everything else. The autumn of 1692 brought with it a chill that went deeper than the weather. By October 19 people had been hanged on Gallows Hill, and one, an old farmer, had been pressed to death in an open field. The jails were still full, the harvest had been neglected, and a profound weariness had settled over the colony. The righteous fury that had fueled the trials was beginning to curdle into a grim, exhausted unease. Giles Corey's death in particular was not a victory for the court. It was a grotesque display that sickened many and planted a seed of deep revulsion. The tide was beginning to turn. It did not turn because of a single event, but because of a cascade of them. The first was a matter of hubris. The afflicted girls, empowered by their celebrity and the court's unquestioning belief, began to overreach. They had successfully condemned farmers, merchants, and even a minister. Now they began to aim their spectral fingers at the untouchables. They accused Samuel Willard, the revered minister of Boston's Old South Church. They accused the wife of Reverend John Hale of Beverly, a man who had, until that point, been a staunch supporter of the trials. For Reverend Hale, this was the moment the crisis became personal. He knew his wife to be a woman of impeccable Christian character. Suddenly, the doubts he had suppressed came rushing to the surface. If the devil could impersonate his pious wife, then the court's core assumption that the devil needed permission was wrong. The entire legal foundation of the trials crumbled in his mind. But the most audacious accusation of all was aimed at the very peak of the colonial government. A spectral finger was now pointing at Lady Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps himself. The fire had finally reached the governor's mansion. For Phipps, who had created the court of Oyer and Terminer, this was the final intolerable straw. The hunt was no longer about purifying a distant village. It was threatening his own family. At the same time, a powerful intellectual counteroffensive was finally gaining ground. It was led by one of the most respected figures in New England, the Reverend Increase Mather, president of Harvard College and father of Cotton Mather. While his son had publicly, if nervously, supported the trials, Increase Mather now threw his considerable weight against them. In October he published a powerful treatise titled Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits. His argument was a direct assault on the court's reliance on spectral evidence. He declared with thunderous authority that the devil, the great liar, could indeed impersonate the innocent to bring them to ruin. He concluded with a statement that would fundamentally reverse the court's entire philosophy. It were better, he wrote, that 10 suspected witches should escape, than that one innocent person should be condemned. This gave educated and influential people the theological cover they needed to voice their own growing doubts. The combination of these factors, the public revulsion at the brutality, the overreach of the accusers, and the intellectual assault from Boston, was decisive. In late October, Governor Phipps acted. He issued a decree forbidding any further arrests for witchcraft. He ordered that spectral evidence would no longer be admissible in any court proceeding, and, in a final decisive move, he formally dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. The legal engine of the Salem witch trials, the special court that had sent 20 people to their deaths, was now silenced. The fever had broken, the hangings were over, but the wreckage left in its wake was immense. The jails were still filled with prisoners, the accusers were still living in the community, and the judges and magistrates now had to face a world that was slowly waking up to the terrible reality of what they had done. The dissolution of the court of Oyer and Terminer was a mortal blow to the witch hunt, but it did not end the crisis. The hangings had stopped, but the jails remained full. Scores of men, women, and children were still imprisoned, many of them the confessors who had been coerced into lying to save their lives. They existed in a legal purgatory, uncleared of charges but no longer useful to a court that no longer existed. The colony now faced the grim administrative task of cleaning up its own mess. In January of 1693, a new, legally constituted court was established to handle the remaining cases, the Superior Court of Judicature. This court would travel to the various towns to hear the cases, but it operated under a profoundly different set of rules. Following Governor Phipps's decree and the arguments of Increase Mather, spectral evidence was now forbidden. The prosecution would have to prove its case with tangible, verifiable proof. The result was a dramatic and immediate reversal of fortune. One by one, the accused were brought to trial, but now the prosecution's primary weapon was gone. The afflicted girls could still perform their fits, but the magistrates and juries, chastened by the events of the past year, largely ignored them. Without the spectral visions to rely on, the cases against most of the prisoners simply evaporated. Grand juries dismissed the majority of the indictments before they even reached a trial. Those who were tried were, almost without exception, acquitted. The system, once forced to rely on the basic principles of evidence, worked as it should have. However, the shadow of the old court still lingered. The new court did end up condemning 3 more individuals to death. Their cases were different because they were not based on spectral evidence alone, but on their own detailed confessions, which, though coerced months earlier, were still considered valid. But Governor Phipps had seen enough. His transformation from the creator of the court to its staunchest opponent was now complete. In a letter to the Crown in England, he condemned the original proceedings, blaming the bloody assize on the zealotry of a few key figures, most notably his own deputy, William Stoughton. Phipps would not allow another drop of blood to be shed. He acted swiftly. He issued a formal pardon for the 3 newly condemned prisoners, along with reprieves for all others still facing charges. In the spring of 1693, he ordered a general release, opening the doors of the jails and freeing the last of the accused witches. The news of the pardons infuriated the unrepentant Chief Justice William Stoughton. When the sheriff arrived with the governor's orders to halt the executions, Stoughton, who was presiding over the court, reportedly flew into a rage. "The Lord be merciful to this country," he thundered, before storming off the bench in protest. His war on witches was over, but his conviction had never wavered. By May of 1693, the Salem witch hunt was officially over. The legal machinery had ground to a halt. The last prisoners were finally walking free, blinking in the sunlight, returning to neglected farms and broken families. The terror had passed, but the silence that followed was not one of peace. It was a heavy, haunted silence, filled with the ghosts of the 20 who had died and the profound, unanswered question of how it all could have happened. The silence that fell over Massachusetts in the years after 1693 was not the silence of peace, but of shame. A slow, dawning horror began to creep into the consciousness of the colony as people looked back at the madness that had seized them. The ghosts of the 20 dead would not stay silent, and the living were forced to confront the terrible question of their own culpability. This period was not one of finger-pointing, but of a slow, painful, and incomplete search for atonement. The first official act of public remorse came in January of 1697. The Massachusetts General Court declared a public day of fasting and prayer, a day for the entire colony to reflect on the tragedy and ask for God's forgiveness for the late tragedy raised among us by Satan and his instruments. The proclamation acknowledged that heinous sins had been committed and that innocent blood may have been shed. On that day, in Boston's Old South Church, one man took that collective guilt and made it deeply personal. He was Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the 7 men who had presided over the court of Oyer and Terminer. As the minister began to read the colony's official apology, Sewall rose and stood before the entire congregation, his head bowed in shame. He had written his own, far more personal confession, and he had the minister read it aloud. In it, he accepted the blame and shame of the court's actions, taking full responsibility for his role in condemning the innocent. He asked for the forgiveness of both God and the community, praying that the guilt of the bloody unrighteous persecutions would not be visited upon his family, the colony, or himself. For the rest of his life, Samuel Sewall would set aside one day each year to fast and pray in private penance for his role in the trials. He was the only one of the judges to ever publicly apologize. Others, most notably the unrepentant Chief Justice William Stoughton, went to their graves insisting the court had done God's work. The apology of a judge was one thing, but what of the accusers? Most of the afflicted girls faded back into the obscurity from which they came, their lives forever marked by their role in the tragedy. But in 1706, one of them made her own public reckoning. It was Ann Putnam, Jr., who at 12 years old had been one of the most prolific and vicious accusers. Now a young woman, she stood before the congregation of the Salem Village Church, the very church her accusations had helped to tear apart. Her own confession was read aloud. She did not admit to lying, but claimed she had been deluded by Satan into accusing innocent people. "I desire to lie in the dust," her apology read, "and to be humbled for it in that I was a cause, with others, of so sad a calamity." It was a plea for forgiveness from both God and the families of those she had helped condemn, most especially Rebecca Nurse. Finally, the government began the slow legal process of making amends. In 1711, the Massachusetts legislature passed a bill that formally reversed the attainder of many of the victims. This act cleared the names of 22 of the 33 individuals who had been convicted, restoring their civil rights and declaring them legally innocent. The bill also authorized a payment of £600 to be divided among the survivors and their families as financial restitution. It was a meager sum for the loss of life, property, and reputation, but it was a profound symbolic gesture. The process was imperfect. Some families, like those of Bridget Bishop and Giles Corey, initially refused to be part of the settlement, the wounds still too raw, and some of the executed, like Elizabeth Johnson, Jr., were simply overlooked, their names not formally cleared for another 250 years. The apologies were incomplete, the restitution was small, but they represented a society trying, however clumsily, to repair a stain on its soul that would never truly wash away. Some stories do not end, they do not fade with the last shovelful of earth on a grave or the final signature on a pardon. They embed themselves into the bedrock of a nation's memory, becoming a permanent part of its identity. The Salem witch trials of 1692 are one such story. The ghosts of that terrible year still walk, not through the fields of Massachusetts, but through the corridors of American law, literature, and culture. The legacy of Salem is not a simple story of a dark time. It is a living, breathing lesson that remains as urgent today as it was 3 centuries ago. The most immediate and concrete legacy is etched into the American legal system. The tragedy of Salem was a hard-won, bloody lesson in the catastrophic danger of unchecked hysteria in a courtroom. The revulsion at what happened helped to sear certain principles into the developing American legal consciousness. The idea that an accused person is innocent until proven guilty, the right to legal counsel, the right to confront one's accusers, and the absolute rejection of unverifiable spectral evidence, these bedrock principles of modern justice were forged, in part in the fire of Salem's gallows. The sacrifice of the 20 helped to build a firewall against such a legal horror ever happening again, but the most powerful legacy of Salem lies in its transformation into a metaphor. The phrase witch hunt has transcended its historical origins to become a universal term for any persecution driven by fear, intolerance, and unsubstantiated accusation. It is a label we apply to any situation where a community, gripped by a moral panic, turns on a scapegoat. This transformation was cemented in the American mind by one towering work of art, Arthur Miller's 1953 play, The Crucible. In the midst of the Cold War and the paranoid Red Scare led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, Miller saw a chilling parallel. He saw how the hunt for communists in the 1950s, with its public hearings, blacklists, and pressure to name names, was a direct echo of the Salem court's demand for confession and accusation. The Crucible used the story of John Proctor and Abigail Williams not just as historical drama, but as a timeless allegory for the courage of individual conscience against the crushing weight of mass hysteria. Through Miller's play, the story of Salem was taught to generations of students, ensuring that its lessons would never be forgotten. Today, the physical legacy of the trials is a study in contrasts. Salem Village, the epicenter of the panic, is now the quiet town of Danvers, where a simple, profoundly moving memorial stands. Granite benches bear the names of the executed, their words of innocence cut into the stone. It is a place of solemn remembrance. Meanwhile, Salem town has embraced its dark history in a different way. It has become a global tourist destination, especially during Halloween. Witch-themed gift shops and haunted tours line the streets. While some criticize this commercialization, it also serves a purpose. It keeps the story alive, drawing new people into the history, ensuring that the names of Bridget Bishop, Rebecca Nurse, and Giles Corey are never truly erased. In the end, the true legacy of Salem is a warning. It is a stark reminder of how thin the veneer of civilization can be, and how quickly reason can be abandoned in the face of fear. It teaches us that witch hunts are not a relic of a superstitious past. They are a recurring human failing. The anatomy of the crisis, the othering of those who are different, the rapid spread of misinformation, the pressure to conform, and the substitution of accusation for evidence remains chillingly relevant in our own age of social media and political polarization. The story of Salem compels us to ask difficult questions of ourselves. When we see a group turn on an individual, do we stand silent, or do we speak? When confronted with a popular narrative, do we accept it without question, or do we search for the truth? The ghosts of 1692 do not ask for vengeance, they ask for vigilance. They stand as eternal sentinels, reminding us that the fight for justice, reason, and empathy is a battle that must be fought anew in every generation, in every community, and within every human heart.